So today at College Recruiter, we're going to be talking about retention of diverse talent. So for HR leaders who are seeing, if organizations who are seeing churning out diverse talent, seeing that revolving door, it will be a challenge to recruit diversity in the future. So today we want to get into that and talk about some of the challenges that HR leaders are facing, like retention strategies, causes of high turnover, the impact of cultural sensitivity, what millennials bring to the table, all that good stuff. So today I'm joined by Martin Edmondson, CEO of GradCore, and by Janine Truitt, Chief Innovations Officer at Talent Think Innovations. Talent Think Innovation. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
My pleasure.
All right, let's get into it. Let's talk about some high turnover. So when you look at the causes of high turnover, what are some of those general causes of high turnover? And then when you drill down, do you see any patterns between or among kind of a general employee population and diverse talent?
So I'll start. In terms of turnover, typically you'll see high turnover where people are overworked, underpaid, where there are hostile work environments, where management isn't supportive, or there's maybe toxic management, when they're not proper controls in place for recognizing good work, and or if people just feel like the work they're doing isn't really making an impact or isn't meaningful for them, you'll kind of see, high turnover. Where it comes to diverse talent, that gets a little bit more granular, I feel. And it just differs. So, some of the things that you may find is that the person doesn't feel like they can show up fully as they are, or they work in a ecosystem where there are not very many of who they are in terms of numbers, and they're not made to feel like they're included or properly assimilated into the workforce. So they feel like an outlier, or they're seeing disparity, very clear lines of disparity where people of different colors are being paid or promoted at different rates at which they're not being compensated or recognized for either similar efforts or extraordinary efforts. And so that can become very frustrating for diverse talent to see, oftentimes where there are maybe inequitable standards for how they need to perform commensurate against what some of their other colleagues are doing. And so that would very much often be a reason why diverse talent would say, you know what, I have to leave this company because here I am busting my behind and trying to do the best and trying to be the most educated and the most skilled. And even with doing that, I don't see the outcomes that I want to see. So for me, though, those are kind of some of the reasons why you would see high turnover broadly and also among diverse talent.
And really, I mean, what you're saying and is everybody wants to feel valued and included. For the majority of a workforce, feeling included may happen more automatically, but for diverse talent, feeling included and valued may not happen very easily for them. And so it's really the same goal for everybody. Everybody wants to feel engaged and valued. But and we'll get into that. So in order to increase that sense of inclusion, people have to, managers and leadership have to drill down into what's going wrong.
Yep.
Martin, what would you add to that? Causes of turnover, anything?
I'd agree with all of that, actually. And I think the challenge really does come back to culture more than anything else. And it's often a real issue where the culture does get toxic, either amongst management or in terms of norms of behaviour within an organisation that don't lead to the right fair treatment for everyone in the same kind of roles. But I think when you drill down as well, you also start to see some interesting stuff in terms of the different groups within diverse talent as well. So actually, we've looked into various bits of research around how actually there's greater emphasis around gender diversity and ethnic diversity, in which actually organizations, certainly graduate recruiters in the UK, are putting a lot of energy and effort into making both the recruitment and the retention process better. But actually, some other aspects of diversity, such as disability or sexual orientation, aren't actually getting that much attention. And so you still have that well, that actually even within the broader umbrella of diversity, there are specific areas in which people aren't necessarily as fairly looked after or given equal support.
Mm-hmm. I'm glad you mentioned norms and the workplace culture, because those are so influential as to whether somebody will feel included. Is norms and accepted behavior. Can you speak to, so on that point, can you speak to the importance of and the necessity of being culturally sensitive and equity, paying attention to equity, and when it comes to retention?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think from what we're seeing, again, over here, is that a lot of organizations are putting a lot of time into a strategy around diversity around their recruitment side, but actually not necessarily always following that through at the retention point. So I think all of the energy tends to go in at the front end in terms of we need to recruit better proportions from a kind of representative group of people, but then doesn't necessarily go in at the retention end, and often equity is the way that tends to play out. And I think it's the point Janine was making really about how sometimes equal effort isn't rewarded with equal reward. And I think that's often due to either different expectation levels. And I think actually retention often, umbrella level again, comes down to expectation disciplines, and it comes down to this combination of what you, how you position your organization when you recruit people, and then what the reality bears out on the ground, and how you then how you go on to manage those expectations as an organization. And if you get that right, actually you can keep people and you can make that work. But if you don't, you can really where things go wrong.
Jean, what would you add? And can you maybe speak also to HR leaders who have traditionally really held on to this idea of fair, especially legally, right? We have to treat everybody fairly. So when it comes to equity, can you speak to that?
Yeah, so one of the points I did want to make is when we talk about company culture, I think we've been thinking about it, I feel, in a bit of a static way, in that, as an employee, you join a company and the company culture already exists. And it's like you have to adapt to whatever that culture is. And I think when we start to talk about diversity, I feel like we've got to shift that a little bit, especially if we're going to talk about cultural sensitivity and equity, because ultimately you have all of these different individuals who are showing up as whomever they are, nature versus nurture in that realm of, where they've grown up, their socioeconomic background, are they differently abled? Are they a person of color? Are they a woman? Are they a veteran? Like all of these complexities. And ultimately as a company, are you asking them to change some of what that is in order to assimilate in your ecosystem? And I guess that's part of the question that companies should be asking themselves is it fair in the scope of employing somebody to ask them to show up to your job and change who they are because you want your culture to be this way, right? So it really begs the question of shifting how we think about that. In terms of your question about fairness, that's a very sticky topic because what's fair to one person isn't necessarily fair to another. And ultimately what we're all trying to do is be as fair as we can be broadly for a lot of different people. But ultimately in that, you're going to have somebody who's going to think this just stinks and this isn't really fair to me. I really think having some of the tougher discussions with people as individuals, around what they want, what their motivations are, what makes them most comfortable showing up to a job, I think is like a step in the right direction in terms of understanding what's fair. And some of the ways that that's been done, although it's been done and done and done, but I do think it's valuable as long as you treat it properly, is employee resource groups, right? So, I mean, that's something that's been in play for a long time. If you're a company and if you've made the playing field such that people really can show up and be very candid and honest about what it's like to be a Latina in the workplace, or what it's like to be a Black woman in the workplace, or a veteran in the workplace, and you're willing to listen, really listen to what they have to say, I think we get closer to understanding what may be fair. And then you can kind of go back and tweak some things so that we get to somewhat of a place of nirvana, if that makes sense. But there really has to be a probably very uncomfortable and difficult conversation. And I think that's the piece that's almost been missing from the diversity piece. It's like, develop strategy, but I don't want to have that uncomfortable conversation because I just don't.
Then your strategy won't work, right? And I also think, to touch on the employee resource groups, I think this is where you were going, is there has to be some sort of conversation from the inside to the outside, right? Yeah. Otherwise, it will just become a bubble where people finally breathe and say, this is where I'm finally comfortable. And that's not much of a retention strategy. So if all you have is that place where they can go and talk to people who understand them, I would say that's not enough. You have to have something where you said, listen, will allow leaders and other people in other teams to listen and hear their stories.
Yeah. I mean, in a lot of ways, the way that I've seen employee resource groups play out is they exist for the employee, almost like a support group. But as far as the senior leadership actually being involved with the groups in a meaningful way to hear what's being said and actually taking actions to change things, those are the companies that are going to excel in this game, but they're far and few in between.
Right. So that would be the next step for a company.
Yeah.
To figure out how to do that. So millennials bring a whole, a different set of values that by now employers are familiar with. And my impression of the whole generation, to generalize, if I may, is there's a bigger demand in the millennial generation to just come to work and be who I am, and it almost rubs up against the workplace culture. Kind of what you were saying, Janine, that to come in and say, well, this is what problem do you have with who I am, and I'm not going to stick around if you can't take me for who I am. Can either of you speak to how this is actually, while it seems a bit of a conflict, can you speak to how it's an advantage for an organization to stay competitive?
I think this is where companies need to be much more honest with themselves and to get a more, I think so much around recruitment in advance of the retention piece is about the trying to sort of say, this is what we're like, these are our values as an organization, but often they're not actually very honest values, and they're not often a really honest reflection of what the organization is really like. And actually we spend a lot of time working with employers saying, actually let's not be afraid to perhaps in our recruitment marketing and things, perhaps tell people about the stuff that's not that great in our organization. Actually, be a bit more honest about actually some of the things that maybe are hard or difficult here, because actually you then start, I think particularly with this generation that might connect with that and say, well, actually I find some of that stuff difficult too. You start to look at a sort of shared value proposition. I think that between employer and person that you might want to hire, and then that again, if you get it right at the recruitment stage, I think so much of this old retention stuff in the end goes back to better recruitment practice. And if you actually get that right in terms of getting your values really clear and setting them out really honestly, and actually starting to be a bit more comfortable. We've seen years and years in UK graduate recruitment in particular that it's been about, for larger organisations, about attracting lots and lots of applications because there's sort of an ego thing about having lots of people apply to the company. Whereas in fact, actually, the shift is far more now to actually let's have less, but actually let's make sure they're good quality. And they fit on a values base with us and share our values with it, because we know how high up the kind of volume, high up in the volume, millennials see that value fit as being, and therefore it's a kind of win-win if we can get that right. Which also means we might rule some people out, and but the challenge is doing that, but also balancing it with what Janine was saying about actually, sometimes companies need to shift that culture so they can actually assimilate the widest possible range of people.
I like your point about being transparent up and in the recruitment side. So pushing recruiters to, or telling them it's okay to air our dirty laundry. And then I could see how that really could make a difference in retention. If somebody knows what they're getting into and they know what the flaws are, it's not a surprise necessarily.
Exactly, and it goes back to this expectation disconnect thing, and it's about saying, actually, if you set a certain set of expectations, we've worked with a few companies in the last couple of years where they've seen real positive benefits in that, because actually, at that point at which perhaps frustration is building up and you're at risk of losing someone, actually part of what you can play back to is to say, well, actually, look, we were all really honest with each other at the outset. This was what we were getting into with this job or this role or this department or this or this bit of the company. So, has something changed from that, which opens up a slightly different conversation and perhaps a more constructive one?
Janine, what do you think?
So I think we're in this era, I'm calling it like the consumerization of HR. In this, and the millennials really are the pioneers of it, in the sense that they're not looking at jobs or work any longer as I should be so lucky, right? So the previous generations, if you look at Gen X was a little more towards that, but certainly the boomers and before, I'm so lucky, I'm grateful, right? The millennials are the ones that are kind of like, I'm not so lucky, actually you're lucky. Because I'm a consumer in this ecosystem,
right.
This workforce,
I'm working for you,
right? And I am in charge, and I'm actively perusing to see who has what I need, and how are you marketing that, and does it resonate? And it really ties also to the boom of social media and how, in this sharing economy, how they choose to share. They really do care about
false perceptions.
Not the perfect world, but
exactly.
This imperfectly perfect world.
Yeah.
Understanding that, yes, there are lines in which you're perfect, and then there's the imperfect, and we want to know that too. And, in a lot of ways, while they might rub up against some of the other generations in the workforce, I think broadly, a lot of the other generations have to admit that they're speaking to things that previous generations felt, but didn't know how to articulate, or they didn't feel empowered to articulate, right? And so it's always been a problem or a issue that people felt like, I'm arriving at a job, I get sold on how great it is, and then like almost like a relationship, 6 months in, I'm not feeling the love anymore. Now I'm starting to see your flaws. I'm starting to see you leave the toilet seat up, and that kind of thing. And I don't know how I feel about this anymore. So I think the millennials have opened Pandora's box wide open to this whole consumerist mindset, where now HR has to almost function as a marketer, and they've got to, think about how they're selling opportunities, and right. whether those opportunities truly tie back to real outcomes. And that's a very different way than how we've operated previously.
So to go back to your point about how older generations have really felt the same way. I mean, everybody has always wanted, it's very human to want to feel like you belong. That hasn't changed. Millennials don't feel any differently, but you're right about them being more vocal. And it makes me think of the whole movement, the Me Too movement, where women are coming forward about incidents that happened 20, 30 years ago, and they just didn't feel, I mean, times certainly have changed, but they didn't, nobody wanted to be harassed 20, 30 years ago, but now there's more of a sense of empowerment. Like, nope, this is not okay.
Yep.
Can we talk about actual tactics, retention tactics, and to fit into a whole strategy? And one of the things that I'll throw out is a stay interview. Can you speak to what a stay interview might do for diverse talent specifically, or if there's another strategy that you like to hold on to diverse talent? Speak to that.
So I'll start on, stay interviews, I think, are something we just started talking about like in the past few years, but I think they're important because previously we were just focused on exit interviews, which is not exactly prescriptive, or predictive, right? It's kind of like, oh wow, you're leaving. Oh, let's now talk about what went wrong and let's fix that moving backwards. It's almost like a retrofit. And so I think we know now that that doesn't exactly work. And because ultimately, when you look at any survey done on any given year, all the big companies, small, medium, large, they want to retain the good people they have. It comes up over and over and over again. But we can't quite get a handle on it. And I think with the state interviews, it's good, but really what it's coming down to is communication. There just has to be constant communication. Yeah. And I think managers have to be better able to read when they need to be having that conversation. So there should already be some sort of flow to how communication happens among teams within the organization. But what I found in my business is a lot of the misunderstandings, a lot of the reasons why people decide to leave a company or not trust the company they're working for has to do with lack of trust, with feeling like they weren't communicated with or told things that were important to their job or important to their standing in the company, whether it's not being told about an opportunity in their department that was maybe slipped to some other people, right? That's very damaging. Or if the company is going to be furloughing or doing a reduction in force, and you can tell that they're telling you just a little bit of the puzzle, but then a few months later you find out like the company's in a lot of trouble in the news, and there's financial implications. Like I think all of those little things are the things that chew away at morale and ultimately have people feel like I'm not comfortable here. I don't know where I stand. Can I even trust these people anymore? And so, I think we've got to look at it as communication in general, but with the state interviews, it's also an opportunity to say, 3 months in after somebody started with your organization, hey, how are you liking it? Do you feel like the work aligns with what we told you when we hired you? If not, how can we improve? What is your relationship with your manager? How can that improve? What's your team dynamic like? Are you comfortable in that team dynamic? Do you feel like you can show up fully every day? Is there anything you're lacking from a resource perspective that we can help you with? Very simple questions, nothing that's rocket science. But when you're asking them, you make the person who has to answer them, you put the onus on them, right? Because now they can't say, this company sucks, they're terrible, they don't listen to what I have to say, they don't care, right? Now you're putting it back on them and you're saying, no, we recognize that you're part of the solution. We know we're not perfect, and we're asking you for your partnership and how we can be better.
I think, a critical piece after that, though, is taking that feedback and making some changes, because you can have stay interviews across the board and everybody would feel excited about, giving their feedback, but then 6 months later, if nothing has changed, then you are back where you started. Or Martin, would you add anything? Oh, go ahead. Yep.
I was just going to say that's the piece, if I have to, leave anything with companies about where they're missing the mark. They're really good at compiling it. And in fact, the technology has lent itself really well to us getting this information. But the follow-up piece, what you just said about like actually doing something with it, that's where we're missing the mark.
Mm-hmm. Fair enough. Anything to add, Martin?
I know. Well, other than to say, I think kind of related to that, really, we're obviously more broadly in kind of HR seeing this shift from, we've seen a shift over however many years from the big set piece appraisal kind of review point in a year or 6 months or whatever to a kind of iterative, little and often kind of feedback thing. And it's how you then coach and develop managers so that they understand, again, the point James making, that what's the sign then that says, actually, I need to elevate this into a more serious conversation. The early warning signs are here that someone's disaffected, might be likely to leave, and therefore we need to have that kind of stay interview style conversation at this point. And I think when it comes to the kind of then big picture strategies, I think it's about both the coaching and managers in that context, but it's also about using all the data that's available to us within an organisation now to use that to spot early warning signs as well. And I think there's some useful parallels from the kind of higher education sector and in retention as well, because they're interested in retaining their students in colleges and things. And we found that that's been a growing trend to use, multiple data points to understand when a student is at risk, and you're thinking actually they might bail out this course, this program. We should intervene with a personal tutor and get alongside them, because you've spotted through the patterns in data that you come to understand. And I think they become more and more important in this context, to apply that in HR context as well.
Yeah. If HR leaders could have a profile, at their fingertips of employees, and like you said, multiple data points that show the the likelihood that they're going to bail. Quick, do a stay interview. Quick, find out how they're doing. What are some short-term initiatives? Go ahead. Yeah. Did you have something to add?
Yeah, I was just to say, as I say, we've seen that work in a university context, and it seems to me there's no reason it can't work in a HR context.
And intervention, essentially.
Yeah.
Is there anything that you would leave this conversation with for HR leaders to keep in mind, particularly, a lot of people might be looking for short-term solutions, kind of a Band-Aid for the time being. Let's not say Band-Aid, but a short-term solution, kind of stop the bleeding while organizations kind of figure out a long-term strategy.
So I think, particularly now, if we want to talk about like really what's quite topical, especially here in the US, you mentioned Me Too. And so sexual harassment's at the top of people's minds. And, there's certainly a lot of racial rhetoric that I think is, swirling in people's heads all the time, given what's going on. And for me, I guess part of what I want to encourage companies to do is to understand that life and work are blending at a rate that they can't even imagine. So whereas it's really convenient to think about work is work and life is life, I don't think that that's realistic anymore. And I think that companies have to get ahead of what we see playing out in society and really decide on what end of the coin they're going to be and how they want to address that. And they need to address that in a really real way. They need to address it broadly, but they also need to address it with more focused groups in terms of diverse talent to understand how those groups may be feeling about the rhetoric. You have a company who has dreamers working for them. Right. You need to be talking about that, whether it's uncomfortable or not. This is not the time for the canned training and development. We have a diversity problem. People are angry about not feeling heard. Mm-hmm. And so let's roll out a respectful workplace training. It's not going to work anymore. This is the time for focus.
It probably never did.
And realistically, it never did if they actually asked the people that were on the receiving end of that. But especially now, people want real dialogue, mm-hmm. and they want real change. And the companies that are able to humble themselves and do that, I think, are going to be way ahead of the 8 ball.
Mm-hmm. It makes me think that the desire to be apolitical, for a corporation to be apolitical, is a thing of the past. And mm-hmm. I see more and more CEOs becoming activists, essentially, from their position of power.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I think that speaks to the point earlier as well about the values-based positioning of organisations. If you actually really mean it and you live up to it, then you've got to speak out, haven't you, on things? And if that's it flies in the face of those values from either a recruitment or a retention perspective. If you position yourself as being strong on diversity or strong on the sort of things around millennials or whatever it might be, if your values are rooted in those things, and then a societal issue crops up in that area, and you just say, "Well, I can't comment on that because I'm a business."
Right.
But, it doesn't suit me to comment on that because my share price might go down or something. Mm-hmm. Well, actually, I think, as you say, I think that position becomes less and less tenable. And I think we obviously in the UK have had some pretty vocal debates over various issues, different issues to the US at the moment, but still equally vociferous around the Brexit and the EU and all of that. And we've got a lot of people feeling vulnerable in their jobs who are EU citizens one way or another who don't know whether, in theory they've been told they can stick around, but actually there's not a deal on that, and it creates a great deal of tension. And it's exactly the same thing about having to open up that dialogue with those people, but also increasingly you're seeing the leaders of those organisations actually speaking out publicly and entering the political debate and saying this is just fundamentally wrong that these people are being left in this position.
Interesting. Yeah. Great. Any last thoughts that we should leave our conversation with?
No, all good.
We've
all
touched
good.
on it all. Well, thank you to both of you for being with me today. Thanks for the conversation. Thanks for your insight.
No, thank you.
Thank you.
And we'll be in touch.